Cheers to the publisher for sending across a review copy. If you enjoy the content, then do consider sticking around. Remember, we give away a free Nintendo Switch game each and every week in our sales video. Before we start this review, I want you to take a little look at Ark Survival Evolved on the Nintendo Switch. Just picture that. Hold that picture in your mind as we delve into Crysis Remastered on the Nintendo Switch and ask ourselves the question, is this another disastrous Nintendo Switch port, or perhaps Crysis averted? Oof, let's find out. As far as first-person shooters go, Crysis was always one of the more in-depth in terms of its story. You take on the role of Nomad. He's a new recruit to the Raptor team. It takes place in a fictional 2020, which at the time in 2007 was the future, with the vast majority of that storyline centered around an island invaded by North Korea. They've taken hostage two archaeologists, a father and daughter combo, who have stumbled upon some mysterious alien artifacts. What follows an initially pretty standard mission can only be described as something akin to a science fiction film, with the arrival of the climate-changing alien horde and a twisting tale that predominantly takes place over the island and centers around the nanosuit wearing Raptor team. Even after all these years, the storytelling is standout, particularly in its field and in its genre.
Where the excavation site is located.
How can you be sure?
I'm not, but it's all we've got to go on. We need to get...
And bar some particularly hammy voice acting and some cutscene moments that Michael Bay would be proud of, and there are some moments in the gameplay and story that reminded me so much of Predator in the best possible way. If Arnie had popped out from the undergrowth, I don't think anyone would be too surprised. It still managed to do a better job than most do to this day, particularly when you look at most first-person shooters. In terms of the gameplay and controls then, let's start out with the controls. The developers have put in a decent amount of work with this area on the Nintendo Switch. There's gyroscopic aiming, the ability to invert the axis, however these aren't split so you can't do X and Y independently, which is a shame. What I also noticed, or didn't notice, was that gyro aiming doesn't have a tweaking slider, so you can't change the sensitivity of it. I mean, I might have missed it somewhere, but usually that would be right below the option. As it stands though, they have used it quite sensibly, but there is one tweak I would strongly suggest most of you make. Now the gyro is set to a very low level, which is fine because you use it for the finite aiming, things like headshots down a sniper scope, but by default you have aiming assisting set to on, and it's really dodgy. You go to use your gyro and it will just kind of pull you in the wrong direction. So if you turn that aim assist off, you'll have a much better experience overall. For the first 10 minutes or so, it just felt wrong. Other options include several difficulty modes, brightness sliders, and tweaking of different audio levels. Thankfully, the performance is good, but I'll talk about that more in the performance section next. The gameplay is facilitated by decent performance, obviously, but you control your character moving with the left stick, control the camera with the right, and use a little bit of granular aim with the gyro if you so choose. The main difference about this and any other shooter that came before it was how well they'd managed to implement the nanosuit technology, and it makes you feel like you're actually wearing something in the game.
Engaged.
Footsteps have a heaviness to them, yet you can hold down the jump button to activate a power jump, which uses a little bit of your energy bar down here, but allows you to vault off the ground and land down on enemies' heads or jump through roofs, and the same goes for grabbing them and throwing them with force or any of the items in the world. The other two main skills that you have are really choices about how you want to approach the gameplay. One of them is a cloak, allowing you to, obviously, go slightly invisible. If you get too close to the enemies, they will still see you, but for the most part you can crouch and creep behind them and release that inner predator, stalking your prey. Option number two then is the all guns a blazing approach, and is facilitated by your second ability, which is to increase your armor. Both of these are controlled with the LB and RB buttons, and both will drain stamina at a different rate depending on A, are you taking damage, are you running, are you crouching, or are you laying prone, which can be done by holding down the crouch button. The next large element of the gameplay are the maps. Now the level itself, or I should say levels, because there are slightly veiled transitions between large areas, but they're designed to allow the player to approach them in several different ways. You may have an objective on the other side of a harbour, and you could swim, you could take a boat, You could grab a car and drive around the outside, or you could just run through with your armor on full, shooting everything that moves. I'm not going to lie when I say that, back in the day when I was building my PC for this, all I really cared about were the visuals. For me, it wasn't too much about the gameplay, it was just trying to get the thing to run. And over the years, I assumed, perhaps wrongly, even though I'd completed it, that was the main reason that people liked the game. But actually, that core gameplay loop of giving you a sandbox area and allowing you to tackle its challenges in numerous different ways is what I now see as the most important element. None of this would work, however, if the AI was crap. And it isn't. In fact, it's surprisingly good. I'd forgotten how good the AI was. There are times where if you make a shot or an enemy detects you, rather than just run at you like headless chickens, as, let's be honest, we're so used to seeing, they'll run away and then they'll flank round raptor style in groups. I remember watching a documentary about the amount of work they'd used to try and get the AI somewhere near competent, and it feels even better than I remember it. Now, the game features destructibility in some form. Not all of the structures are destructible, and in fact they use a slightly clever technique of creating some of the shacks out of movable pieces, which then gives the illusion of pure destructibility. From a gameplay standpoint, it allows for a few new techniques, like smashing a panel out of a roof and dropping onto someone's head, grabbing them and throwing them out the window. But it does also cause a few player issues when you try and do the same on a solid building and absolutely nothing happens, or onto certain items that should be destructible but just aren't. But it's still pretty impressive. You can mount turrets, drive tanks, ride trucks, and generally just blow loads of stuff up. And generally, if you can see it, you can go there, and if you can think it in terms of a strategy, such as this moment here where I was pinned down and looking at a machine gun turret all the way in the distance, then you can usually carry it out in a number of different ways, and you don't feel penalised by poor game mechanics. And the moments where the game was most perhaps frustrating for me was where limits were suddenly imposed on the player. There are boss encounters of sorts here, but for my money, the moment-to-moment gameplay is what was the real win for Crysis, and it still is today. In fact, it probably is one of the best first-person shooters we've now got on the Switch. There's a little bit of everything here. Unfortunately though, there's no multiplayer. It would have been a nice little addition to perhaps earn that remastered title to allow us to do this in co-op. It would have been an amazing little experience, but it's not, and well, it is what it is. It's very much just the original PC version with some slightly tuned and tweaked visuals. They've done a good job with the controls on the Switch. However, I would have liked a few more tweakable options for those players that enjoy inverting different axes and tweaking the gyroscopic sensitivity. Thankfully, the base setup's good, and I give controls 16 out of 20. As far as gameplay goes, it's much better than I remember, if I'm completely honest, and that AI is pretty damn smart. I love being able to hold down a button to add silencers or scopes to my weapon, and there's just something inherently cool about the exosuit design and the sandbox nature of the different areas. I can't quite believe I'm playing it on the Nintendo Switch, but gameplay has most certainly stood the test of time, and for me it scores 19 out of 20. This is probably going to be the most interesting section for most of you, and it's the visuals and audio. And I'd heard a few things prior to making this about how good the performance is, but I have to say there are moments as well where I think we should probably take a look. The game appears to be using a form of dynamic resolution scaling, but overall it's running at a decent screen resolution with not a great deal of blurring taking place. It's targeting 30 FPS, and I say targeting, it's not locked out at 30. There are quite a few dips. Now, at the beginning of the game, it's very smooth and it's all 30, and most of it's very well handled with good frame pacing. However, I noticed that when it all starts to kick off, for example when you get to control a tank, or you're fighting anything where there's going to be lots of physics being used and CPU intensive processes, you can get a little bit of hitching, and you also get quite a dip in the frame rates. I think I managed to get it down to around about 22 FPS, but it does have to be said this is for the absolute minority of your playtime. They've done a fantastic job for the most part, with that 30 being there for perhaps 90 to 95% of your experience. In terms of the image quality, you're certainly looking at low settings for a lot of the areas, but it is nice to still see those crepuscular rays, those god rays shining down through the clouds. And for a handheld console, the texture resolution is by no means the worst I've seen on Switch. It's not amazing, but the presentation's pretty good. Much of the foliage remains intact and has the ability to be shot in half. it will move when players pass through them, but I did notice the animation range for foliage is a little shorter than perhaps you'd be used to if you played a souped up version of the original. LOD bias, or level of detail bias, is also set quite close to the player. You can shift your player forwards and backwards and quite noticeably see areas where items' LOD is suddenly improving, and they almost pop into clarity after being much lower detailed assets. On the fly, you're not really going to notice it, and they've used a few little techniques that some aren't going to like too much to hide some of the imperfections, such as motion blur, which is really quite heavy-handed here, and I didn't see an option to turn it off. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an effect that I don't particularly like. Yes, it makes it look like it's running at a slightly higher frame rate, but it also smears everything out, and in FPS games I switch that off as a matter of course. I'm probably nitpicking, and let's be honest, this is looking pretty damn good overall, and far better than I thought it would. In terms of the audio, the sound seems to have carried over reasonably well. I'm no audiophile, but I did notice perhaps a touch of degradation, almost like they'd used some form of downsampling on certain elements. It's not there for things like gunshots and voices of characters shouting, but there were just some elements that didn't sound quite right to me. You'll have to let me know in the comments if this is something that was there in the original, and again, maybe I'm being too nitpicky, but I noticed it. Voice acting certainly has character.
Until you give me some answers. I'm not buying that locate and evacuate bullshit anymore. Yeah.
However, unusually, my favourite characters ended up being those with the worst voice acting, Psycho, and the thunderous and shifting music that adapts to your playstyle is still as heart-pounding as it was when I first played. The final thing I have to mention is that I've experienced a number of crashes. I've had 3 so far in my review period, and that's probably in about 10 hours of gameplay. Overall, I give visuals and performance still an excellent 16 out of 20. This is a far more challenging port than some of the others we've seen, and it looks and performs better than most. Arc. In terms of the audio though, it's mostly good. I did notice, as I mentioned, a few strange sounding samples, and some of those soup sounds after it runs out of charge or you do a boost run can get a little bit tedious. Overall, it also gets 16 out of 20. In terms of value, you're looking at about 27 quid. And a 7.2 gigabyte download. This one is fully Switch Lite compatible, thankfully, but for my money this is too expensive. Now, as we'll see when the other remasters release, they're going to look completely different to this. If you want the handheld functionality, then by all means, and don't get me wrong, it's pretty badass playing this on a handheld console, but if you just want Crysis, then go and buy it on PC. £27 is too expensive. They should have opted for something in the region of maybe 20, maybe 15, and not having a physical version purchasable is going to put a few noses out of joint. I'll say all of this, but in all honesty, if I didn't own a Nintendo Switch channel, then absolutely I would be picking this one up anyway, just because I love the game and having it on the go is an appeal to me. But I know that's not going to be the case for everyone, and I give value 14 out of 20. So there we have it. I think that's the end of a meme, isn't it? When the Nintendo Switch with the Tegra 1 can run Crysis, in all honesty, my mobile phone probably can. It's a great game, and the core gameplay, which I've given a score of 19, is far better than I remember. It has the best elements of a sandbox shooter, some really quite credible AI, and let's be honest, decent visuals. It scores an overall SwitchUp score of 81%. Please do subscribe to the channel if you like the content and all that jazzy stuff. Hit the bell if you're already subscribed and you want the latest. And a big thanks to our patrons who support us each and every month. You have saved our bacon lots of times. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!